Templates in quilting can be used in lots of different ways. Sometimes we cut out a fabric from a template and then piece it together as if we're doing traditional patchwork. Other times we cut a fabric from a template and then apply it to a background fabric. This is called applique, and it's what we're doing when we make Dresden Plate in this episode of How to Quilt. Lots of techniques for applique. We're going to cover 3 of them in this episode of How to Quilt while making our Dresden Plate. Dresden Plate is such a charming block. I've been calling the one we're making a double Dresden because we are making 2 sizes of template. One is larger, one is smaller. The larger one requires fewer repetitions in order to make a circle. Like the vast majority of applique quilt designs, Dresden Plate uses a template in order to get a very precise shape that is cut out of fabric and then applied to a background piece. And like with any other template, we always want to verify that the size is our target size for the finished piece. This is a printable PDF template that you can put on cardstock or on printer paper. Anytime you print a template, you want to take an opportunity to verify that the measurements are correct. So the templates for the How to Quilt video series sampler quilt all come with both inches and millimeters to make it easy for you to verify that your printer did the job, there we go, that you were asking your printer to do before we cut these templates out using paper scissors, not our good sewing scissors, and then cut them from our fabric. We've got 2 sizes of template here. Template A is smaller and will be uppermost. Template B is closest to the foundation fabric. So I'm using my 2 colors of green to make template B. We need 6 of each of template B. And then I'm using my shades of pink, flamingo, and cerise to make template A. We need 8 of each of template A from the 2 fabrics. I'm going to use my rotary cutter and ruler to trim out these templates from my fabric. In the case of Drunkard's Path, the previous template quilt block in the How to Quilt video series, we could have added an extra 1/8 of an inch on the outer edge of our templates in order to give us room to trim. We do not want to do that on these templates for Dresden Plate because this is actually a seam line where each template will be connected to its neighbor. So I'm going to trim as close to that line as I can, taking care that I'm not trimming the template smaller as I go. I can also, in order to be more efficient, alternate on my strip of fabric. Now I've cut a bigger strip because that was the piece that I had available to me. One of the ways that you can make your cutting the most efficient is to take a template like this and measure the length of it from one end to the other. This one is just over 4.5 inches. So if I cut strips of fabric that were 5.25 inches wide, I could very easily rotate my template back and forth in order to maximize the number of pieces that I cut out with the minimum amount of waste. Templates have a square edge now, but we want them to be pointed in the end. And the funny thing is, that we achieve that by stitching a seam across this edge. We take our templates, we fold them in half. I always say lengthwise, but my kids always say hot dog instead of hamburger, right? So we fold them in half lengthwise, match up these points, and then we're going to stitch a seam here before we press it open. And then the iron is where we really make the shape of this unit by popping it right side out. And then using a tool like, I'm using a knitting needle here, or a chopstick, or a point turner. They actually sell tools specifically for this. And as I'm pushing here, the interior of the seam. If you feel like you really can't get the point you want, you can trim off that little tiny bit before turning right side out. Bink, bink, bink. To get a nice point, which we will then center. I'm going to push my seam allowance to one side, center the seam on the rest of my template. And this is the shape that we're going for on every single one of those templates, A and B, both colors of fabric, until we have all of them ready to go. My template pieces stitched and pressed and ready to go, I can lay them out and start forming the ring that is the basis of our applique shape before I put it on the background fabric. It's really easy to do. I place them right sides together and I stitch a seam here, and then I work my way all the way around until I have a single ring where every edge is stitched to its neighbor. Satisfying when all those edges are joined. I've pressed it all up and I pressed all my seam allowances in one direction, and it can get a little squirrely here depending on how consistent and accurate your seam allowances were. I was tearing through these pretty fast, so I got a little bit of a wrinkle there. If you feel like it makes a cone and it doesn't want to lie flat, give it some steam at the center and it'll ease out those edges. And then remember that all of this is going to be covered up before we move on with the rest of the block. Got it on this background fabric, which is cut slightly oversized. We're going to layer one circle on top of another and then cover our raw edges with an applique piece of fabric. So we start with a background cut of fabric. You'll notice, despite the fact that all of the blocks in our How to Quilt sampler are 12.5 inches unfinished before we sew them all together into the quilt top, that we're actually starting with a 14-inch piece of fabric here. Part of that is because of what applique does to the background. As we sew through the fabric, some of those threads can get hit and moved around by the needle. Sometimes it will draw up the overall size of the fabric because we're adding weight and bulk to it by applying fabric on top of the background. By cutting our background larger, it allows us to go back and trim it down at the end to ensure that we don't lose any of the elements that we've bothered putting on the background to make our block. Job one is to attach this piece to the fabric using applique. Applique, of course, is French, which means to apply, roughly. And we're going to do what's called straight stitch applique and stitch through our folded and finished points all the way around this edge, pivoting at each seam with the needle down. I'm going to do that first with this larger template B. Then I'll do it again with the smaller template A. And when I put A on, I'm going to rotate it just a bit so that all the points don't line up. And again, this center opening, these are the only raw edges we have left in the whole block, will be completely covered. You can see through that center opening that I've pressed my background fabric in both directions to make a center point. I lined up my raw edges, folded in half, pressed it to make a target so that I can center my applique on the background piece. Since I already know it's oversized and I'm going to be trimming it down, I want to be sure that I center this so that once I trim, it isn't asymmetrical on the block, but also so that as I trim, I can center it in case I do need to trim more on one side than on another. In order to applique, I want to pin everything down. And you haven't seen me pin a ton in the How to Quilt video series, but I am on this one because I want to stabilize each of these points. If we take the time to arrange our applique exactly where we want it, we're going to want to anchor it. I am still using my 1/4 inch presser foot, but my particular presser foot has this little notch in the center, which is not a 1/4 inch, it's closer to 1/8 of an inch, and I'm going to use that as my guide. You can use a ruler and a marking pen to mark your stitching line if your presser foot doesn't have that, or you can use a different style of presser foot for this. This is just straight stitching and it doesn't require that 1/4 inch in order to go all the way around. I've started with my needle in one of the seams and I just sew all the way around. I'm going to stop with my needle in the point, pivot and turn, and then keep going. At the end, I'm going to stitch over where I started and back stitch to secure before repeating with the other Dresden plate. At which point we have this. I've obviously used white thread. I've used white thread throughout the entire sample that I'm making here with our sampler quilt. It's more visible for you and it shows up better on camera. You, of course, can choose a matching thread color as you are stitching your applique in place. So now we've got both of our Dresden plates added to our background fabric, but the raw edges at the center remain uncovered. And we need to finish those off. We can't leave any raw edges in our patchwork before we put our quilt top together. We're going to do that by appliquing a central circle. I've given you a template for that central circle, but you don't have to use it. You could use a jam jar or a coffee mug or a small bowl, something, to cut a circle that's going to go over those edges. And there are some different ways that we can applique this piece on. They're included in the pattern for the How to Quilt Dresden Plate quilt block that you can download on PDF. One is hand applique, so we would cut this template out of fabric. We would baste our longest straight stitch 1/4 inch from the edge all the way around, and then you tuck the raw edge under till it bumps up against those basting stitches before hand sewing in place. Another is to use a fusible adhesive. So we cut the template out of our fabric and we put a sticky product on the back and iron it in place, and boom, all good. It's already stabilized and in place. And the third is to do machine applique, where we cut the piece out of our fabric and we do a satin stitch, which is a very, very narrow zigzag all the way around to cover up those edges so they won't come unraveled. I'm going to do a combination of the second two. So this product here is called Heat and Bond. It is a man-made glue-based paper-backed product, which basically means that it's a two-sided sticker. It turns your fabric into a two-sided sticker. So I've already fused it to my fabric here, and then I've traced my template onto the paper, and now I'm going to cut it out. When I remove the paper backing, the fusible adhesive is revealed, so I can place it on the fabric and press it with the iron, and it will stay put permanently. If that is what you want to do, you're finished. It's all done. The edges, when you do fusible applique like that, can occasionally get a little bit of fray on them over time, but because we're also going to be quilting, it's not going to fall off. It's going to be quilted into the final product. I'm going to, however, both fuse it and go to the iron with a satin stitch, which is a short stitch length and a wide zigzag that goes all the way around the entire edge to finish it off. First, I'll have to remove the paper backing here at the iron. You can see that shininess there. That is the Heat and Bond product. So the exposed side I fused to the fabric, and now I'm going to flip it over and mark center here to line center up with center here. Before I use heat to fuse it in place. And this is one of those times where, you know, your whole life when they say don't ever leave the iron in place, you kind of need to. Certainly if this is the only thing you're going to do to applique this piece down is fuse it, you really want to make sure you get a good bond, which includes letting it cool. So I'm going to leave this here and let it cool completely before I test the edge to see if it's fused in place. As long as it's hot, that glue is malleable and it can come back off. If you didn't get a good fuse, go back with more heat and fuse it a little longer. You can also flip it over and fuse it from the back. Ordinarily, speaking of the back, ordinarily if I were doing machine applique like I'm about to do, I would also use a stabilizer product here. There's another fusible paper-backed stabilizer product that you put on your fabric so that as these zigzag stitches go through, they're not biting into the fabric. Because I already have so many layers of fabric, I'm less concerned about that. But if I were doing a fusible on top of a single layer of fabric as an applique, I would absolutely use a stabilizer on the wrong side of the background to give those stitches something to hold on to. At the machine, I'm swapping my 1/4" presser foot for a wider presser foot because it's easier to see what I'm doing there. I'm going to switch to a very short stitch length, about 1 is the measurement, but the widest one that my machine will make. Place my presser foot down so that when the needle goes down, it goes on the fabric, off the fabric, on the fabric, off the fabric. And then I go all the way around. At the finish, I can just overrun where I began. If you look at your stitches and you aren't satisfied with the coverage you got, you can just do another pass in order to thicken up those applique stitches and get a really pretty opaque look to them. After after trimming my threads, I come back to the cutting table and I can trim up the whole block. Remember, I left those pressed marks like a compass. So with my 12.5-inch ruler, I can line up 6 1/4 and 6 1/4 and know that the elements of my applique are centered in the middle of this background. Beautiful double Dresden plate. Dresden plate can be very satisfying. I love this one because it makes a floral design with the Dresden plate, but of course it doesn't have to. You could use all solids for one and all prints for the other. You could use 2 different colors and make it monochromatic. You could fussy cut. We've talked about fussy cutting before. Fussy cut each one of those templates so that you're highlighting a different graphic image, ducky bunny, ducky bunny, ducky bunny, all the way around. You could fussy cut the central circle. For mine, it was that papaya color, but you could have a graphic there, or you could embroider the name of the recipient of your quilt on it. There are lots of ways to personalize Dresden plate that make it so beautiful and enjoyable. If you really like interesting shapes in your quilting, you are going to love what we do in the next episode of How to Quilt when we take on foundation paper piecing.